So Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad. It is a real pleasure and honour to have you here with us today to discuss your latest book, Travelling Home, which comprises of a collection of essays on Islam and Europe, many of which were actually lectures that you gave at various locations throughout the years. I believe one was as early as 2003, so really spanning some time. And by tapping into the rich and broad framework of traditional Islam, you take us through a journey of, as Muslims in the West, how we should navigate a society which, on the one hand, is becoming increasingly hostile towards Muslims, Islam, ethnic minorities and immigrants in general, and on the other is a society which has moved away from monotheistic religion, from perennial truths, and has really embraced quite an atheistic culture. And in the midst of all of this, we are given some insight and perspectives into a plethora of subjects, from the mythical origins of Europe, to what Islam has to say about retaliation, to the war in Bosnia and the tragic massacre of Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica, and why it is so important for us to reflect on that recent period of history. It also seems particularly poignant that we are having this event today on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. There is a lot here to unpack, so brace ourselves for a bit of a ride. Just as a bit of a warm-up, Shaykh Abdal Hakim, why did you choose this image as the cover of your book? So there is a young boy, for the benefit of the audience, staring out at what appears to be a deliberately smashed window, peering at a copy of the Quran that is illuminated. Why did you settle on this image?
Well, as you say, the essays that comprise this book are on a range of disparate subjects, and it was difficult to pick an icon that somehow encapsulated everything. So I think the designer went ultimately for an image that raised rather general thoughts about boundaries, about transgression, about religion, about youth, about ethnicity, but without trying to make too explicit a kind of iconic point. So it just raises a general air of unease, which hopefully makes purchasers anxious enough to click buy and add it to their basket. Yes.
And indeed, like by delving into all these different subjects, it really feels like you're flipping the narrative a lot in this book. And for example, you say that Muslims belong in Europe even more than the atheists, than the Austrian right-wing politician, than the liberal. I mean, these are not concepts that we see in mainstream media, and I think a lot of Muslims don't see ourselves in that way. One other thing you encourage us to do is to rethink our terminology, rewire our brains a little bit. We might talk about some of these words a bit later, but one word that really piqued my interest is Ishmael. You talk about developing an Ishmaelite theology, and you often use the words Muslim and Ishmael interchangeably. Why is it so important to evoke the legacy of Ismāʿīl, this great Abrahamic figure?
Well, everything in those ancient scriptural bifurcations has an ongoing relevance and interest. And in this case, it's one that is differently signified in the biblical, so Jewish and then Christian tradition, and the Islamic tradition. Ishmael is constructed by the authors of the book of Genesis as a sign of unchosenness. He is the firstborn and seems to be evidently the heir to the promise, the land, the multiplicity of children, prosperity and so forth. But then in one of those remarkable Genesis twists, Sarah, who is in her 80s, becomes pregnant and another child is born that is then taken to be the heir to this promise. So right at the beginning of the Abrahamic religions, you have this difficult sense of parting of the ways, which is already present, I suppose, even in the Cain and Abel story. And there are ancient resonances of city dweller against nomad, against in-groups, against out-groups. But this, I think, is the most significant of the bifurcations or the binaries that the Bible authors wanted to work with. And certainly it's always been taken up very energetically as a sign of the chosen against the unchosen. So St. Paul uses it quite a bit, I think, in Galatians. and St. Augustine and the Christian tradition generally, regard the firstborn who turns out not to be the favoured one as the sign of God being a God of distinctions. So, but the interesting thing, if you look at the passage in Genesis, is that there is a lot of implicit sympathy for Ishmael and his mother, because Sarah gets jealous. This is a kind of surrogate motherhood or second wife scenario, and Hajar and the child are expelled or driven out or asked to leave. In any case, they leave into the wilderness, which really was kind of a death sentence in that context. And then you have the first prayer, which the Bible attributes to a woman, and the appearance of an angel to the woman, and a number of other signs of favour which you wouldn't really expect had the initial intention of the text been to present this as the dark other, the outcast, the one that is perpetually to be the adversary of God's people. And that ambiguity actually has been picked up by a number of feminist theologians in particular, who find Hajar as a kind of symbol of the abused wife, the ethnically impure other, etc., the single mother, all of these images, particularly in sort of American womanist, African American theologies. She's become a kind of patron saint of that, even though the Jewish and the Christian traditions often take her to be the great icon of the other. Hajar, Hagar, it means the other, because she's from Egypt and therefore not from the people, and Egypt, by implication, Africa is the sign of unchosenness. Egypt is the place where you're persecuted and you want to escape from, but she is from Egypt. So for those interested in racialized theologies, those interested in gender issues, women's rights and so forth, Hajar has become a kind of heroine, more than the Virgin Mary, for instance. You'll find there's more interesting and appreciative identifications of Hajar as an ideal type amongst feminist theologians than the Virgin Mary, who doesn't seem to do much in the biblical narrative. It's very passive. Be it done unto me according to thy will. Whereas Hajar is this kind of agent. She's active, she looks after her son, she prays. So there's an irony there in that the figure whom Islam claims as the ancestress of the final prophetic Meccan intervention, which for us is a sign that God tends to work with the outcast and not with the privileged, is also being recognised by quite a few Westerners who are also concerned about some of the ethnic and gendered and confessional binaries that are traditionally attributed to the text of the Bible, have found this really very interesting. So there's an interesting convergence between Islamic sensibilities and perhaps that point of view in the Western, even woke spectrum, where one wouldn't expect to see the validation of something that's iconically Islamic. So I find that interesting. But from the Muslim point of view, as disadvantaged, as outcast, as ethnically problematic, as refugees, asylum seek, all of these things that the Hajar Ishmael story seems to be invoking, I think that it's a very interesting kind of proto-narrative for us, particularly in diaspora situations in the modern West. Ishmael is the one who goes out, he's the kind of refugee, and he doesn't return the way Abraham seems to, or the way Odysseus does at the beginning of European literature. You know, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the end is when he returns home. But in the Islamic tradition, Ishmael doesn't return home but finds a new place which turns out to be a neglected sanctuary. And so from that time, Islam has been the religion of migrants, of muhajirin, of the extraordinary globalisation of the Islamic message, which before the modern world and the growth of the great European empires made Islam the religion of global trade and migration and pilgrimages, and we were the first internationalists or globalists, really. And so Hajar and Ishmael, as kind of proto-founders of the religion, seem to be a very interesting sign of the mobility of Islam, and therefore an interesting theological, scriptural point of departure where when we reflect on what it means to be Ishmaelites here in the heartland of the civilization that historically fought us most bitterly, where we were always typecast as the Ishmaelite other. The Spanish Inquisition took itself to be following the biblical instruction to expel Ishmael and Hajar. which they saw as being the Semitic other, the Jewish as well as the Islamic. So it's a very interesting predicament for us to be from that narrative, which is historically the other of Europe, but to be here and somehow trying to find not just a modus vivendi, but also some kind of theological imperative. So I'm using that theme, and I do find it to be an interesting one, and so much more can be said about these rich biblical and Quranic archetypes, about what does it mean, what does Isaac mean, what's the etymology of it, what did Ismāʿīl mean. So yeah, I throw it in as a kind of theological trope without trying to make a big aqidah point out of it. But I think that poetically, if you like, the idea of Islam emerging as a migratory, asylum-seeking, refugee, outcast style of religion is quite a good basis for the creation of some sort of liberation theology in our precarity in the modern West.
So instead of this cover invoking then a sense of unease, shouldn't we in a way embrace that role then of being the outcast, of the outsider?
Well, the Quran also says, وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ. We want to bless those who are rendered weak in the earth and make them imams and make them the inheritors. It's not necessarily right for one always to be existing in a kind of outcast and miserable agonistic situation. That happens to be the way of the world, which is a very unequal and unfair and tyrannous place. But it's not necessarily the case that it is a situation to be celebrated, but rather one which one acknowledges as a certain inevitability, that the people of God necessarily, especially in a kind of uber-materialistic, pharaonic world such as that of modern turbo-capitalism, it's appropriate that God's people should be in a position of marginality and weakness. That where you find the divine and sincerity and God's people in this age is not in the sort of smart crystal cathedrals of American evangelicalism where everybody is driving an SUV and you have a Dunkin' Donuts in the lobby and it's all the American dream. That's not where you expect to find the divine favour in an age such as ours. You expect to find it in the little Bangladeshi mosque or the Kurdish taxi driver or the guy who's just swum the channel. That's just part of the nature of the divine, that the divine favours the outcast. But it's not necessarily the case that we make a cult of that in a sort of monastic or poverty-vowing way. I think instead we need to be thinking about how inevitably the people of God in an age such as this tend to be disadvantaged, mustad'afin, but what can we do not only to protect ourselves but to try and remedy the dire circumstances and the structural and the spiritual inequalities which have brought about the current endlessly increasing inequalities in our world.
And building on that, indeed the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that the whole earth is made a mosque for us as Muslims. Reading from this passage from a chapter that deals specifically with atheism, a theology of the Ahl-Kitab, which I presume is a play on the phrase Ahl-Kitab. You say here, Ishmaelites are not in exile in a strange land. As believers they are never abroad, for the man of praise, the Prophet, peace be upon him, indicates that one of the khasa'is, the unique traits of his community, is that the whole earth has been made a mosque for me. In this prophetic optic, the land of Europe, however secular, is already a masjid. It is the Ishmaelite's brow, not the atheist, which touches the European earth. That's a very visceral image. Why do you think that the Muslim belongs in Europe more than our French or German or Spanish atheist counterparts?
The Muslim belongs everywhere, partly because of the khatmiyya, the universality of Islam, which is encapsulated in this hadith, which says not just that the Muslim belongs everywhere, but everywhere is a mosque. And the fact that there is no continuation of ancient teachings of chosenness about a people or a land, Muslims aren't sacrally obliged to go back to some uniquely special place. And the Hijrah really manifests this. The Holy Prophet doesn't return to live in Mecca, he lives in his city of Medina, thereby prefiguring the enormous Muslim story of going out and settling in new places and intermarrying in so many diverse ways. And I think it would be helpful to see the new Islamic diaspora, if that's still the right word, in the West, as an extension of that, but also as a challenge to see if Islam's historic patterns of indigenization can still operate. And that's why I like one of the chapters in Ivan Agueli's book, which I was talking about in a recent CMC lecture, where he is writing for certain skeptics about his Islam, who say Islam is just a foreign thing. It's classified as an Asian religion, and you study it in a faculty of Oriental Studies. It can't belong, although it can be tolerated, by saying that Islam is actually experienced as a repatriation, that one's belongingness to a local narrative, broadly understood but deeply understood, is actually accentuated by the conversion to Islam. So he says that the most Indian people he knows are actually the Muslim people in India. And he travelled quite extensively in Sri Lanka and in India, and he got the sense that what really belongs there is actually what is Islamic. And it's a very aesthetic and abstract judgment. He points out that the Persians really found themselves and found their verse after Islam arrived. And so he says that to be Muslim in Europe is to become, in some strange sense, more European in ways that may be very difficult to explain. And certainly if you travel in convert communities, you find that very many of the human types that you encounter tend to be very explicitly of that place, as if Islam has somehow held up a magnifying glass to whatever is best about their relationship to their place and to their tradition, and made them more of that. And I think that's a good observation, because I have found that quite extensively, and I think it's always been a feature of British Islam. If you look at its beginnings, say, with, at least in recent times, with Abdul Hakim, and you see half of his poems are about the Holy Prophet or about Ottoman wars against the Greeks or something, but the other half are all about the hills and the mountains of the Isle of Man and folk songs and the gorse bushes, and it's very, very rooted and very British. And I think that's a sign of the genius of Islam, the fact that it localizes itself. So then the related point is, how much do we belong? Obviously, with people who've come here from abroad, there is a generation or two of understandable reconfiguration and reorientation. But we're already seeing the success of that, insofar as most of the new generation of British Muslims know how to operate here and have a sense of belongingness more than if they went back to their grandparents' place in Bangladesh or Iraq or wherever. But more deeply than that, as you look around, you see the alienation that modernity has inflicted upon European cities and villages, and how people are detached from the sensibilities that originally shaped the cultural style of those places. And one can make the claim that the Muslim actually kind of belongs more. So, for instance, once I was in Madrid with an immigrant person, and we visited the church of the Spanish armed forces. Here we have the Guards Chapel, and there it's a church which is quite close to the Royal Palace in Madrid. And kind of at the centre of the church, there is the big image of St. James, Santiago Matamoros. He's on his horse, and he has a very white face, he's kind of smiling, and being trampled underneath the hooves of his horse, there is a black guy looking a bit sad. That is the national emblem of Spain, and is there as part of the imagination of the Spanish armed forces, because Spanish identity historically is shaped by the millennial conflict with expelling the Moors. Now, this ethnic minority person I was with wasn't particularly overwhelmed by this, because it's a very strongly racial thing as well as anti-Muslim. The two are often very difficult to separate. In fact, modern racism was probably invented by the Spanish Inquisition, who had this idea of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Even if you were descended from a Jew or a Muslim, you were disabled. You couldn't cross the Atlantic, for instance. You couldn't go to the New World. You couldn't join the aristocracy. It was quite racist and explicit. So the paradox that European Muslims are facing is we are in countries which have historically figured themselves in opposition to a non-white and a Christian other, but they now no longer respond to this image of St. James, Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Muslim killer, who's the patron saint of Spain. He's called St. James the Muslim killer. His images are everywhere. And their big pilgrimage to Santiago, which is the biggest pilgrimage in Northern Europe, is to St. James the Muslim killer. So you get to the cathedral in Santiago, and there's the big image of St. James the Muslim killer. But nowadays, some of those images are a little bit kind of uncomfortable. So you can see that the church authorities have strategically placed vases and sort of sprays of flowers, so you can't actually see the sad, decapitated black heads which St. James has neatly sliced off with his nice Christian sword. It's all a bit kind of difficult to relate to now. And the newer generation, which is alienated from that through modernity and globalization, therefore finds it increasingly difficult to relate to any local narrative. And the styles are the styles of global modernity. They eat burgers rather than paella. They're modern, atomized consumers. So the question is, if that process has been accelerated by the religious collapse of what was once the kind of mad hyper-Catholicism of Spain, and that's gone and been discredited. Franco tried to keep it going, but that's discredited as well. Is it the case that the Muslims who you see in those places now, the sort of Moroccan guys who are running restaurants and their wives in hijab, that actually they are in some sense closer to the better aspects of the Christian sensibility or the Jewish sensibility that once shaped the country? So in Europe, could it be said that substantively it's the Muslims who are more in continuity with what was deeply important to the religious aspect of that culture than most secular people are? Because they can see God in the world and they kind of understand the aesthetic of traditional buildings and traditional forms of life. They have a sense of what a pilgrimage ought to be about, whereas for an atheist it's just talk from a different planet. So that's one of the things I'm speculating with, that Muslims actually coming to Europe are travelling home insofar as whole earth has been made a mosque for me, but also because we can be more at home in what the far right would consider to be the place we don't belong than most secularized people, because we maintain belief in God and certain family and other values that the mainstream have now lost sight of. So we have become more indigenous than the indigenous.
Is it not easier, though, for you as a white European Muslim to show that you can be both European and Muslim? What about ethnic minorities?
In a certain kind of way, but I don't think it really matters, because I engage with so many of the new generation who email me constantly saying they can't relate to the khutbahs in their mosque and they are being told by their parents to marry in a particular way and they don't relate to that any longer. And they have a kind of liking for aspects of what this country is about. They quite like freedom of speech and all kinds of possibilities that they might not otherwise have. That generation, I think, is looking for a way of feeling that they belong, rather than just feeling that they're tolerated or that they're economically beneficial. 40 years ago, I found that there was a big difference between converts and migrant Muslims, but I think that's been very substantially eroded now, because 97% of British Muslims go to non-Islamic schools, and inevitably they're shaped, whether they quite admit it or not, by certain British habits of thought and certain recognitions of certain cultural forms. So I find that, if they can overcome the initial sense that, oh, this is what those people do, and actually see, the way in which the land was traditionally used and cultivated and how houses were built, and certain humility and traditional forms of life, that they can have a sense of ownership of that, even though of course it won't be complete, because the past can never completely belong to anybody.
And one of the ways you think for us to feel this ownership and for Muslims to demonstrate the universalism of Islam is to, what you say, incorporate local customary norms. Yeah. Again, to read a passage from page 209 here from Theology of Kitab. While rejecting Blairite demands for conversion to extreme social beliefs, we must revive the ancient Islamic practice of incorporating urf, or local customary norms, into our lived Muslim experience, wherever and whenever this does not challenge a revealed requirement. And you were quite critical of the way certain Muslim leaders are sort of practicing Islam in the West today, and specifically some Sufi communities as well. What are some of the problems that you see in the way that some Muslims are practicing Islam?
Well, the sense in which they confuse urf, or local cultural norms, with a Muslim identity. The mosques in Germany that have Turkish mosque written over the door, and in which everything is a perfect replica of the way it's done back in Turkey, even though the Moroccans who come may not relate to it, the local converts may not relate to it, and it becomes an obstacle to da'wah, because here urf really means the customary way of the local place. It doesn't mean something from somebody else's urf. That, I think, adds to a lot of the cultural and cognitive dissonance, or the way in which tariqas, which historically always enculturated themselves, so dhikr in Kurdistan is Kurdish and the dhikr in China is full of Chinese stuff, when they establish themselves in Western Europe, they often are quite keen to provide exact facsimiles of a circle of dhikr in Morocco or something, or in Turkey, and they all dress up in Turkish clothes or Moroccan clothes or whatever it might be, and everything sweet Moroccan tea, and it's all like a bit of Macness, even if everybody there is a Jamaican convert or something. They import somebody else's urf, which is not the traditional norm of Sufism, which has always been a way of enculturation. Mosque design is another example. It's interesting to reflect that when the Muslims moved into Spain, everybody knows that they like to use those famous horseshoe arches, the Moorish arches, but actually those are Visigothic arches, because the churches and other public buildings in pre-Muslim Spain used that form. So instead of saying, oh, we want to do everything the Middle Eastern way, they said, oh, look, they've got this local tradition, let's do something new and even more amazing with it. So they built the mosque in Cordoba and the Alhambra, and it's one of the miracles of global architecture, but it's specifically Spanish. So I think mosque architecture in this country, if the mosque elders are determined to make it look like something in Egypt or Sudan or Bangladesh or somewhere, that's not what Islamic civilization has historically done. There's no Sharia requirement to have a pointy dome and the other features of the admittedly great Eastern forms of building, and it may well be that a lot of money is being spent simply proclaiming Islam's foreignness in a way that will benefit the far right, the anti-immigration people who say, look, these people, they don't belong. And I think that's one of the problems with mosque architecture in Western Europe. The French mosques that look like Moroccan mosques and the Swedish mosques that look like Iraqi mosques, that is an inappropriate understanding of the idea of urf. We need to indigenize, localize, use whatever is religiously neutral of local themes, not just in architecture, but in shad, in poetry, in literature, in all of the cultural forms that go with and that enshrine and present religion. And we're not really there yet. It's starting to happen. Some very interesting new mosques in Holland, for instance, that use a lot of Dutch themes and colours and shapes, which are very successful and make an enormously reassuring point to neighbours, that Muslims are also respectful of the culture of others. But there's still a mindset amongst the elders that Islam is not just a religion, but is also the culture of a land of origin, and that has to be defended as zealously as we defend Tawheed itself, which is simply a misunderstanding.
And indeed, traditionally, Islam spread in many sort of lands because Muslims travelled to non-Muslim areas and they mastered the local culture and language, and they were able to, say, compose a poem in the local language that reflected Islamic principles that was so astoundingly beautiful that it brought a lot of people to the faith. Yet we live in a day and age now where we're constantly distracted. We're far more interested in Instagram and the next Netflix drama than a beautiful novel or poem. Do you think that us Muslims writing some literature that's really profound will have the same impact as it used to? And do you not think then, building on that there is merit in us being adept at more image-based mediums like filmmaking or comic book writing?
Sure. I think that's the case, and there are already gestures in that direction, even though older generations and many traditional ulama may not know what the boundaries are. Somebody wrote to me just last week wanting to know whether he can do a comic book about a Scottish drug dealer who converts to Islam, and can he use rude words, and these are kind of difficult issues. To what extent do you use some of the less ethical dimensions of that inner city world in order to present a message? But there's so many genres, such as the novel, where one could imagine and one can see a completely sacred message being put across through the considerable subtlety and psychological insight that religious novels can generate. Dostoevsky, for instance, one could see how that kind of genre could fit very well in a Muslim context. And there are Muslims who are getting into those spaces in the Islamic languages and in the West as well, even though there isn't really a kind of cultural or an ulama infrastructure to support them. It tends to be people operating on the basis of their own conscience, and who may not have particularly strong Islamic backgrounds. But inevitably this will happen. So even though the young are glued to their phones, a lot of people still do read novels. They go to art galleries, they're interested in exhibitions, they like new buildings. So the world is decadent, but the classical genres of artistic production, they are still active. They're not on sort of life support thanks to Arts Council grants. They're still living and with us, and we need to get into those spaces.
So really, this is a form of dawah to our non-Muslim neighbours. But when you look at our own community, from economic problems to social issues like rising prison rates to great internal division, both ethnic and religious, how can we, as you say in one of your chapters, seek to heal and build the society around us when it sometimes feels like we're the ones most in need of healing?
Because healing others is one of the best ways of healing yourself. Service, khidmah, is one of the basic principles of Islam. Of the Ansar, the Quran says they preferred others to themselves even though their need was greater. And so taking in refugees, asylum seekers, dealing with community issues, helping out people who are suffering from this loneliness epidemic, etc., etc. Even if we have endless problems ourselves, we should be in those spaces, because there's a certain cleansing of the soul that comes about through service. And in many of our traditions, particularly service to animals, as we've seen with this text that we've been looking at, because kindness to animals, and again, Agueli, who I spoke on recently, was interested in this, which is an important aspect of the Sunnah, is particularly spiritually beneficial because the animal can't thank you or pay you or do anything. It's disinterested. And that was how Khawajah Baha'u'ddin Naqshband started his spiritual journey. His teacher told him to look after the street dogs of Bukhara for 7 years. So all of those spaces are spaces that we need to get into, even if we ourselves, like Baha'u'ddin Naqshband, are in rags. Ours is a community of service, and very often our mosques tend to be rather insular, and they're not really interested in the local social problems, and the little old lady who lives opposite who hasn't been visited by anybody for 5 years, and the disaffected youth in Muslim communities and out of Muslim communities. We're in our little fortresses, and I don't think that's good for the soul, because despite the outward proficiency of modern Western consumer society, there is a lot of inward pain. The fact that in this country we now have history's first Minister of Loneliness indicates the extent to which there's disintegration going on in society. 11 million people are believed to have diagnosable levels of loneliness, which is now a recognised medical condition with the NHS. It's a society in which there's an enormous amount of suffering. So we should be out there, even if it's only a little bit, but we should see ourselves as people who are giving and helping and looking after people, even in a very simple way, just sort of smiling at somebody in the street. The hadith says that that's a sadaqah. So I think we have problems in our community, but that doesn't excuse us from helping others whose problems in many ways are actually worse, whatever we might be being told. Muslim community in many ways does kind of hold together. People still sort of have a marriage structure, a sense that marriage is normative. The extended family for many people is still a kind of reality. Neighbourhoods in many largely Muslim areas are still sort of functioning as neighbourhoods in the way that perhaps for non-Muslims 100 years ago was the way everybody lived, but now isn't. So there's basically the Muslim community, even though on the surface it's a mess, has a lot of intact stuff within it. But with secular communities, on the surface everything is very slick, but within there's a lot of deep spiritual dysfunction. That's where we should be reaching out.
It's wonderful we hear the sound of the wind because it directly relates to the question I'm about to ask. You talk about nature and the importance of connecting with it and how it heals us, which in turn, inshallah, means we can heal those around us. In fact, the penultimate chapter here is called Creation Spirituality. It's one of my favourite chapters. A lot of us Muslims, we're familiar with the hadiths about treating animals with compassion. But what this chapter shows is that our relationship with nature is so much more than just a set of do's and don'ts about animals and trees and so forth. Even certain acts of worship are intrinsically tied to the cycles of nature. So there is a passage here that is really illuminating. In Islam, the sacral act is guided by the cosmos, by the motions of sun and moon, and the cyclicity of the prayer by which man begins upright in heaven, falls to earth, and then ends in the balanced position of jalsa between the two, which is the caliphal posture. It's fully integrated into the motions of the solar system. Muslim worship is cosmological, affirming enchantment of the cantillated narrative. In its cyclical movements, we move from air to the clay from which we are made, and to which the symbolically defiant forelock is necessarily pressed, after which, thanks to the act of prayer itself and the peaceable surrender which it enacts, we find that balance is restored. Do you think that we've lost a lot of that symbiotic relationship with nature that we're meant to have? And especially now that we're all living in these urban communities, how do we retrieve it if we've lost it?
Yeah, I was talking about this a little bit this morning, that we're experiencing what some are calling a nature deficit syndrome. And it has to do with still, I think, scientifically poorly understood neurological issues. We know that Homo sapiens has been around for tens of thousands of years, and our current form of life, maybe 50 years, and it's extremely abnormal. It's not normal to our physical or psychological makeup, the way in which we exist nowadays, and the extent to which the brain's plasticity can adapt indefinitely to increasingly weird forms of social existence and technological interfacing is not really known. But the fact that there are so many epidemics of allergies and mental health problems, anxiety and so forth, particularly amongst the young, indicates that we're kind of getting near our limits. Because what we're designed for is a fairly primordial hunter-gatherer lifestyle in which we're engaging with nature 24 hours a day. And we still have a sense when we are surrounded by virgin nature or when we encounter animals, and children certainly have this, because it is part of the fitra, it's what we're designed to appreciate, that there is a certain ease that comes from being in a natural environment. And the genius of Islamic art and architecture has always been that it brings that into the domestic and the sacred environment, with geometrical and stylized, tessellated vegetal motifs. It indicates for us, it bodies forth the intrinsic symmetry and beauty of the natural world. And that is what we are used to, and we are certainly not flourishing in our modern high-tech aluminium, high-speed train, Ryanair environment. That's not what we are for. And again, as I say, the neurologists are not sure what the long-term implications for the quite delicate balances of the brain might be of all of this. but it's certainly the case that the species is malfunctioning in various ways, and the outward malfunction of our ecosystem is just one example of that. It's the outward manifestation of something that's happening inwardly. The two are symbiotic. So the forms of Islam, because they are unchanged since the time of their formulation, which in terms of their emergence in space and time was in an oasis city in 7th century Arabia, where nature was primordially present and existence had really, presumably not really changed since prehistoric times, although they had iron, but otherwise it's a very ancient kind of environment, puts us back in an ancient space where we are aware of the rising and the setting of the sun, when we are aware of the seasons, the moon, which it seems has some kind of strange influence on us, just as it has on the tides, but it's very controversial and poorly understood, has an impact on us and therefore reconnects us to a kind of fitri, normal environment. And I think a lot of Muslims have that experience, say when they go to the mosque for Fajr, and when they go in it's dark, and when they come out there's a bit of light, and they feel, I have participated in this amazing fact of the beginning of a new day, in some way that may be very difficult to articulate, but there's a certain peace and serenity that is voiced in the Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah at the end of the prayer, which indicates that through the prayer, which is our fundamental act, we are reintegrated into the fundamental cycles of life in the cosmos, which shaped the cultic as well as the practical lives of our ancestors. And I think this is one of the meanings of Islam as the religion of fitra, that even though we may be holding down a high pressure job, we can't get away from those things which are most important to our ancestors. The seasons, rising of the sun and the moon, we're all linked to that. The way in which we engage with animals ritually through the halal institution, the way in which we have sacred places, non-sacred places, patterns of pilgrimage, ways of expressing ourselves sacrally. You know, there's a dua for going up a hill and a dua for going down a hill. And if you've ever driven at speed with the Tablighi Jamaat, you know, you'll notice them all quickly saying the dua as they go up the hill and then down the hill. I was with the Jamaat in America once, and it was fine when we were in Michigan. Then we got into West Virginia or somewhere, and they couldn't really be, anyway, mashallah, they were following the sunnah, up the hill, subhanallah, Allahu Akbar. That is what human beings always did. And I think that must be a profoundly healing thing for us. And so many people are looking for something like that, but they end up hugging trees or something, or going to Stonehenge at the solstice and playing a flute, or meditating, or doing yoga. And they're not really connected in the way that we are, through the sanad and the isnad back to the Holy Prophet, who represents this kind of oracular figure in the virginal beauty of the Medinan oasis. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to fumble my way towards in that chapter. And there are a number of Enlightenment European philosophers, such as Schleiermacher and Herder, who, having had, for the first time in European history, relatively accurate information about Islam, thanks to the early Orientalists, then said, well, Islam comes later, so why isn't it better than our Christianity? There's Judaism, and we know Christianity is better than that. Islam comes later, so it becomes a kind of crisis for them. So what they say is, but Islam is a kind of shamanism. It's really primitive, and it takes people back to those ancient times when they were really connected to nature, and their lives were shaped by sunrise and sunset, and so that's too primitive for us, and we're people of the Enlightenment, we want to move forward. So Christianity is actually better because it disconnects us from those natural roots. Schleiermacher in particular is interesting on that. So yeah, they describe Islam as a form of shamanism, which is not perhaps what the average Maulana wants to say, because after all the Seerah is a battle against animism and a certain type of image worshipping shamanism. But in the context of a green theology, I think that these very primordial aspects of the religion do make our necessary centrality to the environmental movement something that we need to be establishing. And alhamdulillah, plenty of Muslim countries and organisations which have strong green initiatives. For instance, do you know which country in the world has the highest percentage of renewable energy?
It's not going to be the one that I'm thinking of, so...
It's actually Morocco.
Morocco.
Yeah.
Okay.
You'd think, oh, it's probably Finland or
Yes.
somewhere, but it's actually the Moroccans. So, you know, the world's biggest wind farm. They are doing something. Indonesians also very good with the annual 1,000 new green mosque initiatives. So they're almost not completely asleep. But we need to see why that is, you know, mandated by our theology. We're the khulafa, we should be the custodians of the green world. It's the materialists, not the religionists, who've messed up the environment. Modernity should be penitent. Religion is not implicated.
And of course, climate change is one of the existential crises of our world today. What do you think Muslims then can contribute or offer to the climate change movement or to discourse around sort of global warming and so forth?
Well, there are individual initiatives that one can take by choosing what kinds of things you buy and what you do with packaging, what you drive, how often you fly. Those are, I think, morally significant decisions for all of us. And I was recently interviewed by a guy in New York who's championing this sustainable lifestyle thing, and he's very happy that his annual electricity bill is less than $1. Yeah, because he's just shifted his life around. That's fine. And that he fills like one trash bag every year. There's a lot of people who are doing that kind of sort of green athleticism. But it also has to be a collective thing. Governments ultimately have to carry the main responsibility, I think, because the problem is so big and global. But also religious communities and mosque communities, because the technologies are becoming cheaper, it can actually save your mosque money if you introduce green technologies, photovoltaic cells, maybe a wind turbine or so forth, and switch to a green tariff. So I think that our mosque congregations and mosque elders should be pushed in this direction, because it's a matter of survival really for Bani Adam, and because we have this beautiful doctrine of Khilafah, Muslims should be leading the charge rather than tagging along sort of sheepishly behind everybody else, which is often the way it looks.
Going back to what you said earlier about alienation and Europeans being disconnected from their sort of heritage or sort of indigenous culture, you say that populism is a secular evolution and one that reflects a sort of very chronic spiritual recession, a sort of moral vacuum. Do you think there's a direct correlation then between this rise in national populism, and it's really one that we've not quite experienced before? It's not quite left-wing or right-wing. You have right-wing politicians adopting what traditionally would have been quite liberal left-wing values. So it's an odd one. It's quite radical and new. But do you think there's a relationship between this phenomenon and the spiritual recession, this alienation?
Yeah. I think one reason why a lot of liberals are confused and wrong-footed by the rise of these xenophobic populisms is that they incorporate a lot of socially progressive language. It's not particularly obvious that something like Marine Le Pen's National Alliance, or whatever she calls it now, is straightforwardly of the traditional right, because she's very pro-feminist, gay marriage, a lot of woke issues which you wouldn't identify with the right historically. But it's also the case that populism throughout the 20th century in Europe was often successfully advocated by people who said that they weren't of the left or the right. So the Nazis, the most obvious example, called themselves National Socialists because they brought in a lot of statist, big government things which the traditional right, which like small government, wouldn't have envisaged at all. But it is a movement across Europe, and each European country has its own dynamic based on quite often historic narratives of conflicts with Muslims. So in Spain, again, in the 18th century they had this debate, that was under the Bourbons, I guess. Is our patron saint, England has St. George, France has Saint Louis, who is going to be the real patron saint of the new Spain? Would it be Teresa of Avila, or would it be St. James the Muslim killer? And they said, oh, St. James the Muslim killer, obviously, because that's part of their national story. It is their national story. And that can be very easily repristinated as part of a narrative of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrationism. Because if our national identity is defined as non-Muslimness, those people cannot belong. Those are the people against whom the Inquisition was fought. Those are the people against whom we've always defined ourselves. They're the black mass, the dark other, the Saracens, the Moors. So on Europe's edges, that is the dominant narrative of the new populists. In southern Italy, for instance, certainly in the Balkans with Serbian nationalism, they go right back to their struggles with the Ottoman Empire, and which they present in a very mythologized way, because the Serbs were generally pro-Ottoman during the Ottoman years and fought some of their major battles and became senior Ottoman officials. Or you go further east to Russia, which, a little bit like Spain, has always considered itself to expand at the expense of Muslims. That's how the Cossacks originated. And I was reading Vasily Grossman recently, the mid-20th century Russian Jewish chronicler of the Second World War, but who also wrote about the gulags. And he has a character who's in one of these camps, who remembers how as a boy he'd been playing in the mountains of Adige, which is historically Circassia, and he'd found this ruined village, and there were still apples on the trees and cherries, but everything was ruined and the forest had taken over. So he went back and he said, Dad, what happened to those people? And they said, they're not our people, those are the Muslims, they're the Circassians, and they went off to Turkey, where they belong. But Dad, why couldn't they come back? Because they don't believe in progress. They're not ours, they're not of us. So, the Circassian massacre is the biggest single act of ethnic cleansing in Europe in the 19th century. But because it was so complete, hardly anybody remembers. People know that Boris Johnson's great-grandfather was a Circassian Hafiz, apparently. But most of the journalists don't even know what a Circassian is, because 90% of them were killed. It was a higher proportion of Circassians died in Europe than 100 years later Jews died during the Holocaust. It was kind of a complete annihilation. So when the Russian Federation had the Winter Olympics, I think it was at Sochi 10 years ago, the surviving Circassian organization said, don't put the stadium there, that's where our martyrs are buried. It got into the English press and people thought, martyrs, Circassians, are they like the Taliban or something? And this is a very weird thing. But for them, it's their life, that's their story, and it's a shocking tragedy, a shocking story. They were just deliberately exterminated in the 1860s, I guess, and most of them still aren't allowed to go back. So the point is that wherever you have the borders of Europe, you have a sense of national belonging that is historically shaped by non-Muslimness and by an often genocidal conflict with Muslims. What happened to the Khanate of Siberia? None of them survived. Nobody even knows that there were Muslim places there. What happens when you go east of Kazan? Ivan the Terrible, Europe is defined by Pedro the Cruel in the west and Ivan the Terrible in the east, kind of symbolic boundaries of this horrible genocidal process whereby Islam, which is the third replenishment of the Abrahamic story, is forcibly and viciously driven out. Which of course is a huge paradox given that it's also supposed to be Christian. Turn the other cheek. Well, they certainly didn't do that. You have the Knights Templars and the Knights Hospitallers and the Knights of Calatrava, monks dedicated to war against Muslims. Very strange civilization. There was a case I was reading about in Germany in the 16th century when Turkey was expanding, and he was a Protestant, part of the Radical Reformation, and he said, the Bible says you must love your enemies and you mustn't fight. So we should let the Turks come, and we'll be treated the way the Greeks are treated, and we'll still have our churches, but we mustn't fight. And for that, of course, the church had him tortured to death, because you're not supposed to say that. But historically, had they adhered to the gospel teaching, we'd see minarets all around us here, we wouldn't see spires, because the early Muslims went 93% of the distance from Medina to Cambridge. Then they were stopped in central France. There was only a little bit left, but they became these sort of super warriors. So it's hard. Europe is the continent that has historically defined itself as the harbinger of a battle to the death against the Saracenic other, the Ishmaelite, the impure. And so these populists can quite readily reach for those stories. A little bit harder in England, Scandinavia, and places that geographically were not coterminous with the Islamic world. But still, the stories of the Crusades and King Arthur, and it's there somehow in the national narrative, but it's not as central as it is in Spain, for instance. So, the populists often reach for that, but it's complexified, I think, fortunately, by the fact that the churches have moved on. The churches are just embarrassed by St. James, the Muslim killer. It's too outrageous. Russian churches, Orthodox churches are still a bit unreconstructed. But generally, the churches in Western Europe tend to be supportive of refugees, asylum seekers. They make initiatives to support them. So the religious dimension of European populism has largely drained away in the West, which is, we have allies now with other religious communities, which was not the case in the past. Similarly, it's harder for them to use the straightforward language of scientific racism because of where that led in the 20th century. So they find it hard to find an ideology. It can't be religious any longer. It can't really be racial any longer. So it has to be about the intrinsic unsuitability of Muslims for life in civilized Europe. So it becomes Islamophobic. Otherwise, it can't really exist. And most of their arguments are extremely crude, based on typecasting of extremist movements here and there. So I don't see them as an intrinsic threat, but given that there's no other ideology around, people don't have anything to believe in or fight for any longer. So they end up losing in Afghanistan to a bunch of hillbillies with Kalashnikovs, NATO, because they don't, what are they there for? Well, they're not really quite sure, but they want to build women's rights or something, but it's not really a worldview or an ideal. It's just holding the space for some liberal thing, and so they fail. And that, I think the loss of the European narrative, the loss of overarching grand philosophical and religious schemes is going to make it really difficult for these populist movements to sustainably gain power. If you look at the fluctuations of the fortunes of the BNP in this country, that were sort of getting 15-20% of the vote in places like Rochdale and Nelson 10 years ago, hardly anything now. The Austrian far-right party of Jörg Haider is now imploding thanks to various scandals. There isn't really a strong idea there, as there was in the time of communism and Nazism and Christianity. It's kind of empty. It's defining Europe and belongingness only in terms of what it isn't, rather than in terms of something that it really is. So I see it as something inherently unstable and probably not destined to go much further. But the Muslims need to contribute much more manfully in pushing it over, I think. Otherwise, their lies about what our religion says are going to be accepted by default. And today is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So we've seen a lot of reflections on the good and the bad of the relationship between the Western world and Muslim minorities, and the growth of Islamophobia, but also the growth of Muslim communities. Mosques have more than doubled since 9/11. The increasing interpermeation of Muslims with other communities, which often tends to be the best way of overcoming prejudice. People read something online that says that Muslims like to kill Jewish babies or something, and then they talk to their Muslim friend and they say, oh, I've never heard that. And, there's no substitute for actual human friendship and engagement, which is another reason why we shouldn't be afraid of sort of broadening the circle of our acquaintances. That's always religiously a valid thing to do, and that's how da'wah is progressing. So yeah, it's the 20th anniversary of that sort of great exhibition of Middle Eastern stupidity, that sort of primal scream that brought nothing but disaster upon the Muslim world, but it's also sort of soured the atmosphere for so many people in the West, and probably worse in America than here, because the surveillance thing and the paranoia about Muslims is something in many ways worse. But then I was talking to this New York blogger guy, and even though Muslims are only 8% of the population of New York City, and they had this spectacular, horrible outrage, the city of New York now recognizes Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha as public holidays. So despite everything, they can do that. We don't do that in this country or any European country. So there's still a certain decency there that is pushing back against the demonization, which does give me hope for the longer term.
You paint quite a hopeful picture, and a positive one to some degree, but the reality is that there are many Muslim groups, individuals out there who are behaving in a way that is anti-dawah. Going back to our earlier point that you are encouraging us to use different terminology, one that is often in the book is the word Tanfīr, which you define as repelling people against religion as opposed to attracting them. And again, a passage here: the Jahili Arabs were under the authority of ego and fearfulness, thus their way of existence and their personal presence were ugly and disturbing. The man of praise then showed beauty and hearts melted. This is why Tanfīr is so absolutely condemned in the Sunnah. The sound hadith instructs us to bring ease and not hardship, good tidings and not repulsion. As a commentator observes, the hadith commands us to give people the good news of God's grace and wide mercy, and forbids us to repel them. One who drives human souls away from Tawheed is a Tanfīri and is accursed, since he or she is directly undoing the work of the prophets. And this is in the chapter, The Venomous Bid'ah of Tanfīr. What actions exactly fall under the category of Tanfīr, and why exactly are they so venomously an innovation?
Well, I mean, it's a hadith-based term. The hadith says, "Bashiru wa la tunaffiru, yassiru wa la tu'assiru." It's a sound hadith. Give people good news and do not repel them. Make things easier and don't make them difficult. It's a commandment. So this tunaffiru gives us the noun tanfir, which means driving people away, which is the polar opposite of da'wah. Da'wah, the work of the prophets, bringing people to the truth by showing them the beauty and the ease that comes through following the sunnah and the prophetic way. Driving people away is therefore what the devil does. And that's exactly what 9/11 was, a sort of Middle Eastern temper tantrum that was the worst possible way of publicizing a world religion. You couldn't imagine anything uglier. Cruel, random mass murder of office workers, irrespective of their religious persuasion, no discernment, just a dark outrage. And that single event, I think, was probably the worst event in Islamic history in terms of making the world take a step back from Tawheed. Because everybody in the world probably knows that happened, and everybody has seen those iconic images. And if it's connected in any way with Islam, they'll all go, whoops, don't want to go anywhere near that. So that is the great example of Tanfīr in our time, but anything like sort of the Manchester Arena bombings, the Bataclan massacre in Paris, all of that is young people whose moral circuits have been fused by the power of their rage and anger and vengefulness about real things that are happening, in a way that I see as being part of the vengeful culture of the Jahiliyyah, the Hamiyat al-Jahiliyyah, and that is ruled out by Islam, that says the innocent are innocent and the guilty are guilty. So that, I think, is the principal obstacle to the spread of Islam, which is intrinsically this easy and beautiful thing, obviously the third replenishment of the great Abrahamic story. The story of Abrahamic monotheism looks pretty messy if it's not what it says it is. And Central Mosque in London registers about 600 shahadas a year. In Cambridge, about 50 shahadas a year. People are still coming into Islam. Maybe 100,000 according to the 2011 census converts in this country. This year's census may reveal a larger figure. So despite the Tanfīr, the ugliness of 9/11 and the arena bombing and the stabbings and all of these very extreme manifestations of human moral failure and inhumanity, people are still saying, well, that's interesting what you've got. And they kind of look around the edges of these horrible dark scarecrows that are driving people away and saying, well, yeah, what have you got? I see that we're like little birds wanting to eat from the crops, and these people are the scarecrows that are scaring everybody away. But it doesn't always work. People still come to Islam. But yeah, so there's a whole chapter on Tanfīr, which I define as a bid'ah. It's perhaps the preeminent bid'ah, because what greater innovation that misrepresents God's religion can there be than to do things that are so repulsive that people run away from haqq? It's the greatest bid'ah by definition. It has an aspect of an idolatry of the self about it, I think. So yeah, that's a chapter. What did you find in it specifically that you found sort of held your attention? Because that's one of the things that I didn't actually give as a talk anywhere. I think it's an original
I didn't expect
creation.
you to ask me a question. I think it's interesting because you have a chapter that deals specifically with anger.
Yep.
So anger that is for the sake of God versus anger that is from the soul. People listening to the whims of their ego.
Yep.
But I feel that Muslims rightfully, in many situations, have a reason to be angry and to feel vengeful.
Yep.
Yet you say that we ought to be transcending our sense of anger. We ought to be considering that the Islamic vision of justice is way beyond retaliation and eye for an eye. But it seems easier said than done. There's so much hurt and trauma from colonial history and modern day colonialism, if you will. Isn't it a bit sort of blasé to just say, well, we need to transcend anger and not...
Well, I mean, it's the Holy Prophet ﷺ كان يغضب وكان غضبه لا يخرجه عن الحق. He sometimes grew angry, but his anger did not cause him to depart from what was right. And if you look at these kind of suicide attacks and stabbings that we get today, Mecca, under the idolaters, was in a life or death struggle with Medina under the Muslims. Did the remaining Muslims in Mecca go to the marketplace, go to the Kaaba, start stabbing people at random? There's no incident recorded of that at all, anywhere in Islamic history. After the Mongols kill half the Muslims in the world, kill the Khalifa, fill the Tigris with the great books of Islam, build mountains of skulls, what did the surviving Muslims do in the face of that outrage? Well, the Ismāʿīlī group, so-called, engaged in some form of terrorism, assassinations. The Sunnis, no. Instead, the Sunnis put their heads together and said, how can we bring these people to Islam? And that's one of the great stories of our history, that even though Genghis Khan and his people had forbidden halal slaughter on pain of death, and had forbidden the adhan in Bukhara, Samarkand, everywhere, those great centres, no adhan on pain of death, they came to Islam through people like Sayfuddin Yahya Kharzi, through so many of the great Sufis, Najmuddin Kubra, who stood their ground and refused to compromise. The famous story, I think, is of Sayfuddin Yahya Kharzi, who was dragged before the presumably Buddhist Amir in Bukhara, who wanted to test his anger. And so he said, show me how you Persians pray. And so he does 2 rakas, and then the Sultan gets one of his guards to grab him by the head and bang his head on the floor as he's making sujood, to make him angry, just to kind of produce an amusing situation. And then the Sheikh finishes his prayer, and then the Amir says, you Persians are worse than dogs. And he just says, but for Islam, yes, we would be worse than dogs. And he just kind of would not allow his anger to get in the way of talking about truth. And there's a lot of interesting books about how the Golden Horde converted, and they're quite horrible people. What was worse in history than the Mongol massacres in India, in Hungary, everywhere. and yet they ended up converting to Islam. So they become the Mughals, they become the Altan Urdu, they become the Central Asian Khanates, they become the Yuan dynasty in China, and rebuild those places better than they were. The most beautiful book in the world probably is the 28 juz of the Quran of Sultan Ul-Jaytul, which is in the Egyptian National Library. And they're huge things, they're like a metre wide and gold leaf, commissioned by the Sultan. And I was there with the conservator who was working on, I think he actually works on the US Declaration of Independence. He said, this is the most beautiful book in the world, because the thing is kind of a miracle. That was commissioned by Sultan Ul-Jaytul, who had originally been Nicholas, because his mother was a Christian, but the family were shamanists and Buddhists. But he converted to Islam, and Ghazan Khan converted to Islam, and they produced the most beautiful book in the world, having been grandchildren of the people who'd cut off the heads of the ulama and forbidden the Quran. That's an extraordinary episode. And that was achieved by the Muslims not losing it, by not saying, let's go and stab some Mongol-looking guy in the bazaar because we're out of it. Because they had great sheikhs, and they had the tawakkul and the trust in God and the confidence that the beauty of the truth can melt hearts. So if a lot of Iraqis had done that when the Americans invaded, and Paul Bremer or some of the SAS generals converted to Islam, that would be a real victory. That would be decisive and would have sort of historical ramifications. But instead, let's stab somebody, let's blow ourselves up, let's attack a church. Really base stuff that has not yielded anything for them except misery and humiliation. So yeah, anger is real, and some things we should be angry about, but the believer is able to see things in the context of eternity, and to know that God will in the end bring about justice, and that wrongdoers will face the latter day, and that believers are required to show restraint and patience and find ways of conveying the truth even in these apparently impossible situations. One of my favourite movements in Islamic history, again in Spain, is the Elches. In Spain you have the horror of the Inquisition, and on Friday everybody in Spain had to keep their front door open so the familiars of the Inquisition could see if anybody was praying. When you went into any town in Spain, there was a checkpoint, so you had to eat a little sliver of bacon to make sure you weren't Jewish or Muslim. It was totalitarian. And despite that, there were people who continued to convert to Islam even under the Inquisition. They're called the Elches. And the Inquisition was really panicked about them and really punished them very severely. So that's how authentic monotheism operates, not through detonations of anger and despair, but by working for truth even under impossible and provocative circumstances.
Well, Shaykh Abdal Hakim, we've travelled to many places today, but I've been commanded now that we have to bring this to an end. I have a few questions in my hands, but I thought I'd take the opportunity to open it up to the floor first. So where does Ismāʿīl's stories end? Does it end inside of Europe or outside of Europe? And is it voluntary or involuntary?
Well, one can push beyond the limits, I think, of these ancient stories and the extent to which they are created to give us some kind of steer as to how we should behave in our very strange times. The point of the Hajar and Ishmael story is that even though they seem to be refugees, asylum seekers, sort of sent off into nowhere, that they come to this valley without cultivation, that then turns out to be the beginning point of what, in the fullness of God's time, turns out to be this extraordinary and unique new chapter in the unfolding of Abrahamic religion. So that is their place of dwelling. Ibrahim says, Askentu, I have caused my descendants, my progeny, to find this to be their home, their maskan. But of course, part of the sort of punning on the title of Travelling Home is that ultimately we're all travelling home to a home that is not of this world. Yeah, we're all wayfarers. وَمَا هَذِهِ الدُّنْيَا بِدَارِ إِقَامَةٍ وَإِنْ هِيَ إِلَّا كَالطَّرِيقِ إِلَى الْوَطَنِ. This world is not a place where you will remain, it's just a road to your home. So, Ishmael ended his days and is buried at the Kaaba, but that's not the end of his travelling. His travelling is to the Qiyamah and to the Rida of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We hope that that's the home to which we're all travelling.
Linked to that question, there's a question here. How can Muslims be heirs to a fleeting sense of Britishness as we are travelling home?
Because the tradition of urf, which is very strongly stressed in Islam, the fuqaha, as one of their accepted qawa'id of principles of law, say, al-ma'rufu urfan kal-mashru'i shar'an. That which is known through custom is like that which is legislated through revelation. And al-'ada muhakkama, it's a principle that the jurists really insist on, that because of the universality of Islam, because of it being for everywhere, one is required to inhabit a particular place which is not just part of a globalised, universal, ecumenical, unrooted ummah, but is specific. And the different parts of the Muslim world have always been very culturally distinct. Indonesia and Islam has a different fragrance to Uzbek Islam, which is different to African Islam and so forth, and they're all facing the same qibla. So what we're seeing now, and we will continue to see, irrespective of my sort of abstract theorizing, is the enrooting, if that's a word, of European Muslims who increasingly feel confident with their identity, not as a diaspora, but as Rotterdam Muslims, as Oslo Muslims, as Scottish Muslims, and we see those identities really bearing fruit. And of course they have to be selective. We're not going to integrate into the pub culture, for instance. There's a lot of things that are ruled out by Sharia. But in terms of the subtler and deeper aspects of the way in which human communities have, in a constructive way, interacted with the land and the nature that is in the land, I think we're going to see more and more Muslims feeling at home and also registering the sacralities of the land. Shaykh Abdal Al-Jamal, Allah yarhamu, who was very active in the sort of Naqshbandi world in London in the 1980s, he had a zawiya in Dalton, used to take his murids of every conceivable ethnicity, it was very diverse, to some of the places which he felt were holy in England, sort of Glastonbury type places, or places where maybe ley lines were converging. The validity of that, it's not possible to establish or to unestablish it, but he felt that it was very important for Muslims living in a place to be alert to the sacralities that have always been there in that place, which is why you have Muslim community in Glastonbury, for instance, because they're specifically interested in the particular religious quality, spiritual quality of that place. And Muslims have always done that. Many Muslim sacred places wherever you go were once sacred places that belonged to somebody else and belonged to somebody else before that. So that's just an inevitable part of the Ishmaelite expansion into new places and their purification and their inclusion in the Dar al-Islam.
So to change the subject a little, in the book you talked about how the internet played a crucial role in exacerbating this idea of Tanfīr. And there's a question here, should we then stay away from online platforms, especially with young people, particularly for the sake of education?
Well, I mean, the problem with the internet is that it is mindless and amoral. And as we saw last week, one of the sad things that it is shown about human nature is what people actually want to hear and look at. So it's an age of burgeoning conspiracy theories. Something like QAnon or the Great Replacement Theory would have been hard to imagine before the age of Facebook and siloing. And the creation of algorithms that just keep sending you the kind of stuff that you're already looking at. And I think a lot of young Muslims can very unsuspectingly get drawn into that kind of stuff, especially in a sort of vicious fundamentalist dichotomizing and the essentializing of the other. So, books are generally safer. because books can be more easily attributed. But I think all of humanity is now struggling with this new medium. It's having a very profound effect on human culture. In Canada now, most terrorist attacks are by members of incel movements, nothing to do with Islam. And the incel movement is entirely in existence on subreddits and 4chan, unregulated, uncurated platforms where anything and anything can be said. And we don't really know whether the extent to which sort of completely uncivilized and misanthropic views of human predicaments can actually be controlled if the algorithm itself is soulless and the internet is not being directed by any principle, religious or otherwise. We simply don't know, but most of those movements seem to be getting worse as far as one can tell. I mean, the internet can be used for positive purposes, obviously, and we all have to use it. But still, the enormous amount of material that can inflame and misguide particularly vulnerable or unhappy people is, I think, something that is likely to get worse. I mean, the great replacement theory, 30% of, and I talk about this in the book, 30% of Brexit voters explicitly adhere to the great replacement theory, which holds that Muslim immigration to Europe is being orchestrated by a conspiracy of plutocrats because Muslims can be paid less. 30% of Brexit voters. Very high. It originates in France, where there's an even higher number of believers. So, and again, this seems to be directed by the sort of madness of the self-referring algorithms. People are just reinforced in increasingly aberrant beliefs. And a mistrust for traditional sources of authority, mistrust for politicians, for established narratives, established churches, muftis. People are quite fearful and paranoid, mistrustful of classical authority.
So how does the Muslim leader deal with this? Should they go online?
One is online whether one likes it or not. The question is how it's regulated and how improper statements are dealt with. I don't really like the idea of a kind of self-promoting brand of a particular Muslim leader, because that immediately drags it down to the kind of celebrity culture that one finds nowadays, which is certainly the opposite of Imam al-Ghazali's vision of a humble religious scholar who the last thing he wants to do is promote himself. But then if everybody is like that, it's all the self-promoters who end up representing religion. And the Vatican knows this, so they've turned Pope Francis into a kind of internet meme. He washes the feet of asylum seekers and he does certain photogenic things, and it's all carefully orchestrated, not necessarily for cynical reasons, but because they know that unless that is in the space, then everybody will be looking at aliens or some other interesting thing. So in a sense, you have to lower things in order to compete, otherwise you're not in the screen at all.
How do we deal with the secular narratives of Afghanistan, is that right, in the context of travelling home?
Well, the Taliban, unlike, say, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, are not really a thing in the Western world. They're religious nationalists who just want to get foreigners out of Afghanistan. I would say that a lot of the secular commenting quite recently has been quite mature and abashed. There's a certain Anglo-Saxon hubris that has been broken because of the extraordinary, unexpected circumstance of high-tech NATO drone-led robot armies being defeated by these hairy guys in flip-flops. Nobody thought that could, they can press a button and zap you from the other side of the world, and the robot artificial intelligence determines whether you're a valid target or not. Somebody from the RAF told me that a lot of drone strikes are completely automated now by something called artificial ethics, synthetic ethics. So the drone is flying around looking for targets for days, and it sees a truck, and it sees a piece of metal in the back of the truck, and it sees two adults driving the truck, and so it decides that's a target, and it launches the Hellfire missile without consulting any human operator. and this is somebody from the RAF who told me this, and he said actually they find they have fewer innocent collateral casualties if they let the robots do the deciding than if it's some guy who's dressed as a pilot in a cellar in Virginia or somewhere deciding when to press the kill button. So I think it has been a chastening moment for the big empires of the world, but from an Islamic perspective, of course, what kind of Muslim movement finances itself almost entirely on the proceeds of heroin trafficking? Where is that in the seerah or in any conceivable interpretation of Islamic ethics? It's obviously a non-starter. And their interpretation of Islam seems to be a particular dry type of Deobandi Islam that, again, is transcendentalist, to use the category I was trying to reach for earlier, that if God is only transcendent, the world is a kind of emptied, desacralized space where evil has a real presence, and you can demonize people much more easily than if you have the correct spiritual balance between tanzih and tashbih. And the great fighters against colonialism in the 19th century were people like Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, Imam Shamil and others, who were profoundly influenced by Ibn Arabi's school and who were not capable of demonizing people. So Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, even though the French broke all of their treaties with him and cut down the trees and massacred huge numbers of people and demolished the great mosque of Oran to build a railway station and were horrible, they captured him by trickery, imprisoned him in France, and many of his family members died because of the conditions. Then finally he was allowed to go to the Ottoman Empire, and he settled in Damascus. And then there was a riot by the Druze against the Christians, and he was the one who interceded to save the Christians, even though it was the Christian French who had done what they'd done to his country. And the explanation for that, as he sets out in a book that he writes called Letter to the French, is in his Akbarian metaphysic, everything participates in some way, visible or obscure, in the divine the divine life, and that therefore to completely other another human being is simply bad theology. And you always look to see where the divine light is in someone. And Imam Shamil was certainly the same. And the whole Muslim world, I would say, until about 50 years ago, believed in immanence as well as transcendence. So the Taliban are not Salafis, but they do follow a kind of metaphysical system, although they don't talk much theology really, which is liable to the demonizing of human beings and of human difference, which I think is dangerous, and another reason why, from a classical traditional Islam perspective, you couldn't really acknowledge them as a valid expression of the tradition.
So how can we talk about British Islam or French Islam, for example, when we are facing such a globalised world which is creating such a cultural sort of hegemony?
Yeah, how do we integrate into societies that are disintegrating, in a sense? How do we follow the local orf if the local people no longer care about it? If they're not building in a local style, if the houses are not decorated in a local style, they don't know local songs, they're nothings really, they're just part of the global consumer culture. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that there might be a way, and I do explore this in a kind of rather loose way in the book, in which the doctrine of Orf and the fact that we continue the Abrahamic religious story makes us better equipped to engage with aspects of local culture that everybody else has kind of walked away from because it's not as cool as watching the internet or driving a car that no longer looks like a British car or a French car but is just subject to the whims of international design. So it may well be possible that the best argument that we can present against the populists is that Islam can show itself to be a better instantiation of aspects of what is local than secularity ever could. That's a kind of thought rather than a theory, but it seems to me that if the Orf chapters in the books of Usul are correctly read, then that is a real possibility. Because once they've taken away what was once their master signifier, which is God, and the churches are empty, everything kind of comes unravelled, because everything used to be centred on that. So, if you join the Royal Marines, for instance, the first thing you do is to swear an oath which begins, "I swear by Almighty God." And then you've got 40 weeks of hell, but you've sworn the oath, so you're stuck with it. Now, Muslims can take that oath, I guess. It's not a Trinitarian oath, "I swear by Almighty God." What does it really mean if you're a bog-standard British atheist from Newcastle-on-Tyne? What are you saying? So there's a sense in which obviously there are particularities of the Christian thing that we can't get into and we leave respectfully intact as they are. But there's also a larger set of Abrahamic assumptions that are to do more with the givens of monotheism: God, the Day of Judgment, prophecy, virtue, family, which are shared Abrahamically and by a lot of other traditions as well, which is a space we definitely can get into. So we can't Christianize Islam, and we mustn't sort of bring in things that are specifically churchy, even though those have often been at the core of local identities. But there is something that is deeper than that core, which is the basic belief in the monotheistic gods and in the virtues, which even many churchgoers are most focused on anyway. The number of people at evensong in an English parish church who really can put their hands on their hearts and say, "I believe in the Trinity," or "I believe in the 39 Articles of the Church of England," is probably pretty small. But they do believe in God and the general outlines of what Abrahamic religion is about. So yeah, I would say that that would be a very interesting place to go, and something that should be seriously considered if we want to stay here, because Europe is historically very dangerous. Muslims have coexisted with classical India, with classical Africa, China. It was always difficult, but it could be done. Europe was the place that produced, the ethnic cleansing, the killing of the Circassians, the Inquisition. It came from Europe, not from those other civilizations. And the 20th century was even worse in many ways. So we need to think about ways in which we can be completely Sharia compliant, but also fit in, rather than just kind of grumblers in our ghettos who think that if we grumble enough, they're going to concede and make life nicer for us, which may happen or may not, but isn't a very good strategy for communities that want to stay in the long term.
What does it mean to be Sharia compliant in the West? Can we ever implement Sharia? What would that look like?
Well, if you're only 4% of the population, then any consideration of Islamic public law is obviously not a consideration. But there are aspects of personal status law, things to do with marriage, divorce, inheritance and so forth, dispute resolution through the arbitration process. There is quite a bit that can be done. But public law, obviously not.
What is the best way to ward off atheism in the next generation?
Humility, I think. Atheism, in my supposition, comes not so much from logic chopping or the reading of science in a particular way, but by considering deep questions on the basis of a soul that has been disturbed, is full of doubt and agitation, and doesn't have a place for contemplation. So connection to nature, a genuine close concern for other people, an awareness of the inherent unlikeliness and wonder of creation. These things are normal to us, settle the heart, and make the atheistic idea, which is that this comes from nowhere and nothing means anything, and the physical constants of the world just pop up out of the primal void just by themselves, a kind of absurd idea. But that sense of it being absurd comes from the fitrah. And people are a long way from the fitrah nowadays, and they can believe in just about anything. As G.K. Chesterton said, if people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. So flying saucers and 50 different genders and whatever it is that's going on now is enabled by the fact that the master signifier is missing. And that master signifier is really there by divine gift, but is generously given to those people who are contrite enough and have a contemplative dimension, and then that light will shine in their hearts and they'll know what are the correct answers to those big questions.
I'm sorry, but I think that was a very beautiful note to end the Q&A session on. Thank you ever so much, Shaykh Abdal Hakim, for doing this, and thank you all for attending. Inshallah, we'll have more opportunities to discuss this book on future occasions, and please buy it. It's right outside for you to purchase. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.